The second participant paper is Dr. Bridget A. Teboh. She is an associate professor in the history department of the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. The topic of her paper is culturally based diplomacy in the British Southern Cameroon, contextualizing African female body and the colonial gaze. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Dr. Bridget A. Teboh. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. The topic hasn't changed. My topic for today is going to be culturally based diplomacy in British Southern Cameroon, contextualizing African female body and the colonial gaze. It is actually one of those case studies, and it's part of a bigger project. So for today, I'm just going to focus on what it means to be a woman in the African context, or specifically in the Southern Cameroon, the former British colony, and how in contemporary Cameroon, many of the people or residents in that country have been forced to move out, either for political reasons or economic reasons, or they're looking for greener pastures, and find themselves in what we call new locales or new residences. And so how do these people survive in quote unquote a foreign land? What do they have to do in order to maintain linkages with Africa, or Cameroon to be specific? And so I use the generic term Africa because part of what I'm going to say actually pertains to many other African countries in terms of those cultural connections, in terms of linking and connecting to people back home. And so because I'm going to focus on the quote-unquote immigrant population in the United States, then I want to focus on a couple of things that make sense in terms of cultural diplomacy. Because those things that allow Africans to connect with Africa, or allow Cameroonians in the United States or anywhere else in the world to connect with Cameroon, are part of those traditional practices that I perceive are integral to what we now call cultural diplomacy. I'm going to focus on three of those things. The first one being the notion of war or warfare as part of that colonial heritage that showed us how women resisted and adjusted to the imposition of colonial rule. And so they used traditional means to resolve, resolve some of their issues, and those traditional practices have been carried on in modern day situations. Now to begin with, let me give you a brief overview of Cameroon. It is one of those countries in Africa that, I don't know whether to say fortunately or unfortunately, was colonized by three powers: the Germans, the British, and the French. And for that reason, Cameroon is the only quote-unquote official bilingual country in Africa in terms of languages spoken, or official languages. The official language of Cameroon is French and English, because the Germans lost their status during World War I, and so their territories in Cameroon were divided between the British and the French. For that reason, therefore, Cameroonians have this colonial heritage that involves not only Britain, but France and Germany. You add to that the complex linguistic makeup of the country. Cameroon has about 265 local languages. For a small country, that's a lot, but it is an interesting place for linguistic studies. Today, Cameroon has a modern quote-unquote government, one that is not necessarily useful to the people in Cameroon. We have already heard from other presenters some of the problems that face African nations with unemployment and bad governance and all kinds of issues that have allowed many people to voluntarily leave the country. Not the forced migration that was experienced during the transatlantic slave trade, but the modern fleeing of African nations because of conditions that are not conducive to human habitat and human rights violations and things like that. However, that said, we have the idea that women in African countries have been quote-unquote victims, marginalized, voiceless, and so on and so forth. Now, Cameroon, like many other countries, has witnessed an increase in cultural diplomacy to resolve specific challenges in society as well as women's history. Indeed, for much of Africa, women, like their counterparts in other cultures, have been defined primarily by their marital status, family positions, and by their sexuality. In particular, in the British Southern Cameroons, the female body was tagged in the mid-20th century by colonial rulers for appropriation and regulation, and came to represent a fraught realm for political and economic processes, policies, laws, etc. There was the need to control women's movements, need to control what they wore, need to control how they cooked their food, and so on and so forth in order to fit with the colonial idea. While such socially constructed labeling and politicization has not ceased in contemporary times as well, developments in education, advocacy, technology have engendered academic discourses on ideas about women's power or women's clout, positions in family, women's rights, and their specific roles in society. One of those roles, therefore, is peace making and using quote-unquote women's power, or what we call in Mogamo land in the southern Cameroons, Ika Meyi. Ika Meyi is the concept of women's power or women's clout. And for that reason, the Mogamo people know that women have always had power. How do they use this power? What do they do with the power? And how do they influence or resolve problems in society? We call it soft power because it is that power of persuasion that is capable of attracting people and educating and enhancing relationships and trust. It is a power that is not involved with guns and bullets, but one that can be generated or engendered through the evil look or giving you the eye or quote-unquote feeding you to death. And so the Mogamo also have another saying that a hungry person is an angry person. And so women in Mogamo land in the British Cameroons knew and still know that it is important to keep people fed. And so instead of going to war, they try to negotiate and lobby by bringing gifts, by preparing food, and by bringing people together and discussing their problems. In contemporary times, therefore, in terms of what we have in the quote-unquote new locales or new locations, many Africans who now live in the diaspora go back to their traditional ideas. To make that connection with their various countries, they still have to meet every month in the general meetings, and some of those meetings are the quote-unquote money go-rounds, that people contribute money. In Francophone Cameroon, we call them tongtin. In Cameroon, we call them jangis. And they are popularly known as money go-rounds because people contribute money every month as members of a particular group and then give that money to one person so that they can start up a business or pay tuition for their children or buy books or buy medication. And so that is something that has been replicated in the diaspora among African communities or among Cameroonians in particular. We also have the idea of cultural days or cultural conventions, which is used to showcase what African countries are about. And so once a year, they meet, they wear traditional clothes, they cook food, and they invite the greater community to come and participate in these festivities. And by doing that, therefore, they are putting cultural diplomacy into practice through food, through clothes, through dialogue and discussions. And it is a very powerful tool Because instead of, quote unquote, standing there and observing these Africans or, quote unquote, immigrants or illegal aliens or aliens, people come together because they're interested in what they've seen or how they carry themselves or what food they've cooked. And they start a dialogue. And so they are no longer, quote unquote, strangers. They now become friends and can work together because they build that element of trust. The last thing in terms of this soft power is the use of language, and I'm running out of time, to try and make sure that people understand one another. Again, because of the colonial heritage, we have Francophone Africans, English-speaking Africans, and so on and so forth. And so in spite of those languages, at these conventions or cultural meetings, people use their local languages, and they try to teach those languages to their children so that they have that connection with Africa. And so those children, when they go back to their communities or go back to school, they usually do what is called a show and tell. During their little events at school, they talk about Africa, they talk about their languages, they talk about food, and so on and so forth. And it makes for a very interesting, good component of what African cultures and African identities are. And so because I don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to jump to the conclusion and say that, as the Mogamos say, women in particular do not wage a war with guns and bombs. And it's difficult to capture the essence of what I'm trying to say in English. But in Mogamo, they say, Meyi ya ma'abid chugwi, which means women sit down, wage a war, and actually win that battle, because you don't see them running around harassing people. But they do win their battles because they have other ways of negotiating and kinder and softer ways to resolve problems. And so what I want to conclude with is the suggestion that in terms of all the negotiations that we need to do, we want to include women in all of the dialogue that is going on, because they are capable of making great changes and keeping peace, especially with all the challenges that African nations are facing. And I will end here for now. We'll take some questions later. Thank you.